The loan officer slid Caleb Mercer's envelope back across the conference table. "That won't even cover the paperwork on a farm worth owning." A few men along the wall laughed. Caleb looked down at the envelope. Inside were 21 years of saved cash, folded deposit slips, and the number he had worked toward so slowly that most people in the room treated it like a joke. He did not argue. He put the envelope inside his coat and walked out. 11 months later, the same bank had outside lawyers studying the deed to 83 acres of pale, crusted ground it had been desperate to unload. A mineral company had drilled test wells there. The early reports did not promise a fortune. They did something more dangerous to the bank. They suggested the worthless land might sit over commercially important lithium-rich brine, with a broader project value that could reach into the hundreds of millions, if recovery proved practical. And the deed in Caleb Mercer's desk drawer did not only give him the dirt on top, it gave him the mineral rights the bank still owned underneath it. The story unfolded in the early 2000s, in a dry farming basin of the American interior West. For most of Caleb's adult life, ownership had seemed like a word printed on somebody else's paperwork. He had worked farms across the dry interior West since his early 30s. He repaired irrigation gates, welded broken cultivator frames, replaced bearings on pumps, drove harvest trucks when somebody was short a driver, and slept in whatever housing came with the job. Sometimes that meant a one-room bunkhouse beside a machine shed. Sometimes it meant a trailer behind an equipment yard. For nearly 9 years, it meant a small plank house at the edge of a ranch owned by a family that rarely came to the property except during tax season. Caleb never complained about the house. The roof leaked during hard rain, and winter wind found every loose board, but it was clean, quiet, and close enough to the pump shed that he could hear when a motor changed pitch in the night. What bothered him was the line in his employment agreement saying the house had to be vacated within 10 days if his job ended. 10 days. He could rebuild a gearbox that had seized under load. He could keep an old diesel pump alive with parts from 3 different manufacturers. He could look at a field and tell where water was moving too slowly just by the color of the soil. But if the owner sold, if the bank foreclosed, if a manager decided to replace him, 10 days was all the claim he had on the place where he slept. He had watched the same uncertainty move through other families. A dairy couple nearby lost a lease after the landlord refinanced. They had built calf pens, buried water lines, repaired fences, and improved a barn they did not own. When the property changed hands, they were given 6 weeks to move everything they could. Another family farmed 300 rented acres for years. After 2-week harvests, the owner sold to an investment group. The family did not lose a house because they had never been allowed to own one there. They simply lost the fields they had treated like their own. Caleb noticed something about all of them. The people who touched the land every day understood exactly what it needed. But the final decision could still be made by someone reading numbers in an office 2 counties away. He did not dream about becoming rich enough to escape farm work. He wanted the opposite. He wanted one place where the work and the decision belonged to the same person. So he started saving. At first, it was almost nothing. $5 after groceries, $12 after fuel, $50 after a weekend welding job. He kept cash in a bank account he rarely touched and wrote the balance in a small green notebook. When overtime came, he saved it. When a neighboring grower needed a pump pulled from a well, he took the job. When a storm tore sheet metal from a machine shed, he worked Sunday with a welding hood on his head and dust blowing through the rafters. There were years when the number went backward. An infection put him out of work for nearly a month. His pickup transmission failed. A family emergency took almost everything he had managed to save that year. More than once, He opened the green notebook and saw that months of labor had disappeared into a bill that could not be avoided. He kept the notebook anyway. After 21 years, the balance was $2,600. It was not enough for a productive farm. It was barely enough for a decent used tractor. But Caleb had learned that banks did not only sell good farms. They also collected what employees called problem properties, small parcels left over from foreclosures, odd strips without good access, saline ground, flooded ground, ground with broken wells, land too poor for a commercial grower and too inconvenient for a developer. Those were the parcels Caleb watched. Whenever the county posted a foreclosure transfer or the bank published a notice for surplus property, he copied the parcel number into the back pages of his notebook. He called. He asked. He drove out after work and looked through fences. Most of the time, the answer was the same. Too expensive. Too many bidders. Already under contract. Or simply no. That was how he ended up in the conference room the day the loan officer pushed his envelope back toward him. Caleb had asked whether any bank-owned agricultural parcel could be bought for less than $3,000. He had not demanded credit. He had not asked for special treatment. He had only asked whether something existed that fit the amount he had. The loan officer, Dale Hargrove, was responsible for disposing of distressed rural property. To him, Caleb had become familiar in the worst possible way. A man with worn work clothes, cracked boots, and a number too small to matter kept appearing around property notices and asking the same question. Hargrove had better clients to deal with, bigger loans, better collateral. People whose paperwork arrived in leather folders instead of a creased green notebook. So when Caleb asked again, Hargrove stopped pretending patience. That won't even cover the paperwork on a farm worth owning. The laughter hurt less than Caleb expected. He had spent too many years being paid by people who thought repair work was simple until something broke at midnight. He knew the difference between appearance and usefulness. He also knew he still had $2,600, so he kept looking. 3 months later, the bank called him. Not because its opinion of him had changed, because one of its properties had become more irritating than Caleb was. The parcel was 83 acres on the outer edge of a shallow desert basin. From the county road, it looked almost white in places. Alkali crust covered broad patches between wiry shrubs. An abandoned well casing leaned beside a collapsed pump shed. The north fence was down. A low drainage swale cut across one corner and held standing water after storms, then dried into hard plates. The bank had taken the land through foreclosure from a failed speculative ranch operation. Before that, it had been passed between two owners who tried different ways to make it productive. One planted salt-tolerant forage on the higher ground and gave up after the irrigation water damaged the soil. Another tried to use it as seasonal livestock pasture, but the old well produced water so mineralized that the animals would not drink enough of it during hot weather. The property had been listed, reduced, listed again, and finally moved into the bank's surplus file. The asking price was $3,800. Caleb drove out after work. He did not see a farm. He saw a boundary. For the first time in his life, he could walk from one corner post to another and imagine that no employer's signature stood between him and the right to remain there. The ground was terrible. The well might be useless. The fence would take weeks to repair. There was no proper house, only a weathered storage cabin with a wood stove, a cot frame, and a roof that had been patched with mismatched metal. Caleb stayed until sunset. Then he drove to the bank the next morning. He put $2,600 on the table. He was $1,200 short. Instead of offering his pickup, which he still needed for work, he offered the one thing he owned that Hargrove believed had resale value: a portable welding trailer with an engine-driven generator, leads, clamps, and a battered steel toolbox. Caleb proposed that the bank carry the remaining balance for 1 year, secured by the trailer. If he failed to pay, the bank could take it. Hargrove stared at the numbers. To the bank, the parcel was costing money every quarter. Taxes, inspections, title maintenance. A property nobody wanted was still a property somebody had to manage. The welding trailer was worth enough to cover most of the gap. The deal was ugly, but the land was uglier. Hargrove approved it. The deed packet was prepared from the bank's standard surplus property form. The sale transferred the bank's interest in the land as it stood, subject to existing recorded easements and restrictions. A mineral reservation box on the disposal checklist was marked not retained. That detail meant almost nothing to anyone in the room. The bank did not believe there was anything underneath the property worth retaining. Caleb signed his name. He left the office with a folder under his arm and almost no money left in his account. A week later, he moved a cot into the old storage cabin. The first night, wind pushed dust through gaps around the door. The stove smoked until he cleaned the pipe. Mice had chewed a corner of an old feed sack beneath the shelf. When he opened the window, he could see the entire north fence lying in sections on the ground. He stood there for a long time anyway. No supervisor could tell him to leave in 10 days. No employer owned the roof over his head. The place was broken, but the broken things were finally his to fix. He began with the fence. After work, he reset posts until dark. On weekends, he patched the roof, cleared brush from the old access track, and built a small rainwater catchment beside the cabin. His plan was modest. He did not need 83 acres of profitable crops. If he could establish even a few workable acres of forage on the higher ground, he could lease grazing to a neighbor and slowly improve the rest. Everything depended on water. The abandoned well became his first serious gamble. He had almost no cash left, so he traded labor for equipment. He repaired a contractor's welding rack in exchange for a day with a pulling unit. He bought used pipe. He replaced the corroded pump assembly himself. He cleaned the well, lowered a pump, and waited while cloudy water climbed the discharge line. At first, he smiled. Then he tasted a drop from his finger and spat it into the dust. The water was bitter. Not ordinary hard water, not the familiar mineral taste of a deep farm well. This was dense, sharp brine that left a white residue on the pipe before the afternoon was over. Caleb ran it into a storage tank and let it settle. The next morning, a crust had formed around the wet line. 2 days later, the new pump began drawing more current than it should. He pulled the screen and found scale building across the metal. Still, he tried to make the water useful. He diluted it with hauled water. He ran a small test line to a patch of triticale. He flushed the soil after each irrigation. He installed a crude settling tank and scavenged filters from an old pump house. For 3 weeks, the test strip looked possible. Then the leaf tips burned. The soil surface hardened. Seedlings that had emerged green became thin and gray. Caleb sent a sample to an agricultural laboratory, hoping the report would tell him what treatment might make the well usable. The report did the opposite. The dissolved solids were far too high for the crop he wanted. Sodium was a problem. Chloride was high. Boron was high enough to damage sensitive plants. The laboratory recommendation was simple. Do not use the water for routine irrigation without major treatment or blending. Major treatment meant money Caleb did not have. By midsummer, his first plan for the property was finished. The forage patch failed. The pump needed another cleaning. His remaining cash was mostly gone. He still owed the bank the last part of the purchase price, and the welding trailer securing that debt was the tool that allowed him to earn extra money. If he could not make the payment, he would lose the trailer. The 83 acres would still be his. But owning land while losing the equipment that kept him solvent felt like winning half a battle and discovering the other half had only begun. People heard about the well. Rural news moves quickly when failure is visible from the road. At the feed store, someone asked whether Caleb planned to salt meat with the water. Another man said the bank ought to put up a sign saying it had finally found someone willing to pay for a dry lake bed. Caleb smiled when he had to. Then he went back to work. Hargrove heard the story too. The banker did not need to celebrate publicly. He had already seen enough distressed borrowers to believe the pattern would finish itself. A man with almost no cash had bought bad ground, spent more money on a bad well, and discovered exactly why nobody else wanted the parcel. All Hargrove had to do was wait. Caleb understood that logic because, for several nights, he believed it himself. He sat on the step outside the cabin with the laboratory report folded in his hand. The paper listed concentrations, ratios, warnings, and recommendations. Every line seemed to say the same thing in a different way. The water was not water he could farm with. For 21 years he had saved to own land. Now he owned land that could not support the plan he had used to justify buying it. He could sell, if anyone would buy. He could keep working elsewhere and use the parcel as nothing more than a place to sleep. Or he could keep spending money he did not have trying to force the ground to become something it was not. Caleb read the report again. This time, one line bothered him for a different reason. The agricultural lab had run a broad elemental screen because the sample was unusually mineralized. Near the bottom of the page, below the irrigation recommendations, was a note that several trace elements were outside the laboratory's normal reporting range for farm water. One of them was lithium. The number did not make Caleb rich. He did not even know whether it was important. But unlike almost everyone who knew him as a farm mechanic, Caleb had spent 6 years in a different kind of job when he was younger, before his shoulder gave him trouble, and before farm work became the steady option. He had been a maintenance hand at an industrial water treatment plant serving a mining district. He repaired pumps, cleaned scale from evaporator lines, changed valves, and watched technicians fight brines that carried dissolved metals and salts through every piece of equipment they touched. His job had never been to interpret assays. He was not a geologist, but he had learned one habit from the chemists and operators around him. When water behaves strangely, do not begin by asking how to make it act normal. First ask what is actually in it. Caleb folded the report and stopped thinking about irrigation. For the first time since buying the land, he asked a different question. What if the well had failed because he was using the wrong definition of value? The next morning, Caleb called the agricultural laboratory and asked whether the lithium number was reliable. The technician told him it was a screening result, not a resource assessment. The sample could be contaminated. The concentration could vary. One well proved almost nothing about the geology, under 83 acres. Caleb appreciated the answer because it did not sound like a sales pitch. He asked what a serious test would require. The technician recommended a certified analytical lab that handled brines and industrial water. Caleb filled 2 clean sample containers, recorded the well depth and pumping time, and sent them out with money he had planned to use for fuel. Then he waited. The second report came back with a result strong enough to justify another question, not an answer. The brine contained elevated lithium along with boron and other dissolved salts. The concentration was not proof of a mine. It did not tell him how much brine existed, how easily it moved through the subsurface, whether the chemistry remained consistent, or whether anyone could extract the lithium economically. But it was unusual enough that the lab manager suggested he speak with a geologist who understood closed-basin brine systems. Caleb knew nobody in that business anymore. So he called the water treatment plant where he had worked decades earlier. The plant had changed owners twice. Most of the people he remembered were gone. Eventually, Someone gave him the number of a retired process chemist named Ruth Delaney, who had supervised lab work during Caleb's final years there. Ruth remembered him because he used to label failed pump seals and bring them into the lab instead of throwing them away. Caleb read the water numbers over the phone. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she gave him the same warning the lab had. A strange well was not a deposit. But she also told him not to dismiss it. Closed desert basins can concentrate dissolved minerals over long periods. If the water came from a larger brine-bearing layer rather than an isolated pocket, the chemistry might interest an exploration company. The only honest way to know was to collect more data. Caleb asked how much that would cost. Ruth laughed once. More than he had. That answer should have ended it. Instead, she gave him the name of a small mineral exploration firm that sometimes evaluated early-stage brine prospects in exchange for an option on development rights. Caleb called. The first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The geologist on the other end asked for the lab reports, the legal description of the property, the well record if one existed, and any old drilling information Caleb could find. The well record became the first real clue. At the county office, Caleb found an old driller's log from years before the bank ever owned the parcel. The well had passed through layers of clay, sand, and evaporite-rich sediments before reaching the water-bearing zone. The notes were sparse, but the geology was compatible with the kind of basin Ruth had described. He also found something else. The bank's title file showed that, during foreclosure, it had acquired whatever mineral interest the previous owner still possessed. When it sold the parcel to Caleb, it had not reserved that interest. Caleb did not celebrate. He made photocopies. The exploration company sent 2 people to inspect the property. They did not arrive in luxury vehicles. They came in a dusty field truck carrying conductivity meters, sample bottles, maps, and a portable instrument case. They tested the old well. They sampled shallow seeps in the drainage swale after pumping. They measured salinity across the flat. They walked the parcel in long lines and marked locations on a map. Caleb followed them at a distance, asking questions when they were willing to explain. The strongest clue was not a glittering rock or a crystal anyone could hold up to the sun. It was consistency. The chemistry that made Caleb's well useless for irrigation appeared connected to a broader subsurface brine system. Still, surface sampling could not show depth, volume, flow, or recoverability. The company offered Caleb an agreement. It would pay for geophysical work and, if the first stage justified it, a test hole. In return, the company would receive an exclusive period to negotiate a development lease. Caleb would keep ownership of the land. If a commercial project ever happened, he would receive lease payments and a royalty tied to production. There was no guaranteed fortune. There was not even a guaranteed second payment. Caleb took the agreement to an attorney in the nearest city before signing it. The legal fee hurt. But he had spent 21 years learning what happened when the person doing the work did not control the paper. This time, he wanted to understand every line. The attorney confirmed that Caleb's deed appeared to include the bank's mineral interest, subject to older recorded exceptions. A complete title review would still be necessary before development, but nothing in the sale documents showed that the bank had held back the brine or other mineral rights it owned. Caleb signed the exploration option. The first geophysical survey came weeks later. A crew laid out equipment across the flat to measure how electrical properties changed underground. Brines conduct electricity differently from dry sediments, so the survey could help identify zones worth testing. It could not tell anyone the exact chemistry by itself, but it helped the geologists decide where a test hole might answer the most useful questions. Caleb watched from beside the old cabin as the crew moved across ground people had called worthless. For years, he had looked at the parcel in the same way the bank had, Bad soil, bad water, low productivity. Now the same bad water had become evidence. That reversal did not make the land simple. It made it complicated in a new direction. The company's first test hole produced brine from depth, and laboratory results again showed elevated lithium. A second interval showed similar chemistry. Then came the disappointing part. One zone had lower permeability than the company wanted. Brine moved, but not as freely as an easy development case would require. Extraction might need more wells, more engineering, or a different process. Disposal and water management would matter. Permitting would matter. Energy costs would matter. The geologists would not call it a mine. They called it a prospect. Caleb liked that word better than miracle. A miracle did not need paperwork, pumps, flow tests, environmental review, or millions of dollars in capital. A prospect did. The company expanded its work because the chemistry remained promising and because adjoining subsurface rights could potentially be assembled into a larger project. That was where the scale changed. Caleb's 83 acres alone were not a billion-dollar island hidden under salt crust. They were a small but strategically placed part of a brine system that appeared to extend beyond his boundaries. If additional drilling confirmed continuity, and if the lithium could be recovered economically, analysts working for the exploration group believed a future multi-property project could carry a value in the high hundreds of millions. Every one of those words mattered. If, confirmed, economically, future. Caleb understood enough to know that paper value was not money in his pocket. But the bank understood something else. It had sold him the rights needed to negotiate. The bank learned about the exploration not through gossip, but through a county filing. The company applied for permission to drill another test hole, and the parcel number appeared in public records. Someone in the bank's asset office noticed the name and sent the filing to Dale Hargrove. At first, Hargrove thought the exploration company had made a mistake. Then he saw the address, 83 acres, the alkali parcel, Caleb Mercer. He ordered the old file pulled from storage. The sale price was still there. The appraisal was still there. The disposal notes were still there. So was the standard deed form. Hargrove asked the bank's attorney a simple question. Did the bank keep the minerals? The attorney's first answer was not the one Hargrove wanted. It did not appear so. That answer became worse after the title department reviewed the file. Years earlier, when the bank foreclosed on the parcel, it had obtained the borrower's remaining mineral interest along with the surface estate. There were older exceptions in the chain of title, but the bank had still owned a meaningful interest. When Hargrove approved the sale to Caleb, the disposal checklist gave him an option to reserve that interest. The box had been marked not retained. Worse, an internal note explained why. The parcel was considered non-strategic agricultural surplus. The instruction was to simplify the sale, avoid ongoing management, and transfer all bank-held interests that might create future administrative cost. At the time, that had sounded efficient. Now Hargrove read the sentence differently. The bank contacted Caleb before it went to court. The first letter was polite. It said the bank had discovered a possible discrepancy between the intended transaction and the deed. The bank proposed a corrective instrument that would reserve certain subsurface rights to the bank, while leaving Caleb ownership of the surface. In exchange, it offered to forgive the remaining balance on Caleb's purchase note and release the welding trailer from collateral. Caleb read the letter twice. The remaining balance was less than what the exploration company had already paid him for the option period. The bank was offering to trade a small debt for the very rights that had made the company interested in his land. Caleb took the letter to his attorney. He did not sign it. The second letter was less polite. It claimed the deed failed to reflect the bank's true intent and warned that the bank might seek judicial correction. Caleb's attorney requested the complete sale file. The bank refused some internal documents at first. Then the exploration company became involved. Its lawyers had no interest in spending money on additional drilling, while title to the mineral rights was under threat. They did not promise Caleb victory. They did something more useful. They paused new work, preserved the existing evidence, and joined the title review. That pause became Caleb's most expensive lesson. He had imagined that once mineral value appeared, his money problems were over. They were not. Exploration payments stopped while the dispute was unresolved. His regular farm job still paid his bills. The welding trailer was still collateral. Legal letters arrived. Weeks passed without drilling. A valuable prospect with uncertain title could be worth less in practice than a worthless field with clear ownership. Caleb kept working his day job. At night he read copies of deeds, checklists, and correspondence with words he had never cared about before buying land. Grant, reserve, exception, interest, authority, intent. The argument eventually narrowed. The bank did not claim Caleb had hidden information at the time of sale. He had not known about the brine. The bank did not claim he had forged a document or failed to pay the agreed price. Instead, it argued that the employee handling the disposal had not intended to transfer potentially valuable mineral rights, and that the form had produced an unintended result. Caleb's side answered with the bank's own process. Hargrove had authority to sell the surplus property. The disposal checklist specifically addressed mineral retention. The bank had chosen not to retain it. The deed then transferred the interest the bank held, subject to recorded exceptions. There was no hidden side agreement, no separate reservation, no statement telling Caleb that subsurface rights would remain with the bank. And most damaging of all, the internal note showed that the broad transfer had served a business purpose at the time. The bank wanted a clean exit from an unwanted property. The fact that the exit later looked foolish did not make it accidental. The dispute went before a judge. Caleb sat behind his attorney in a borrowed jacket that did not fit well across his shoulders. He remembered the conference room where Hargrove had laughed at his envelope. This room was quieter. Nobody cared what Caleb's clothes cost. The question was what the documents meant. The judge reviewed the deed, the foreclosure chain, the disposal checklist, the authority records, and the internal note. The ruling did not say the bank had made a wise deal. It did not say Caleb had discovered a guaranteed fortune. It said the sale documents controlled. The bank had the authority to convey its interest. It used a form that addressed mineral retention. It chose not to reserve those rights. And there was not enough evidence to rewrite the transaction, simply because later information made the transferred interest more valuable than anyone expected. Caleb kept the mineral interest conveyed to him. The bank released the claim. The exploration company resumed work. The first substantial payment Caleb received was not a royalty from a producing mine. There was no mine yet. It was a larger lease option payment that allowed the company more time to drill, test flow, study extraction methods, and assemble neighboring rights. That distinction mattered to Caleb. He had spent too much of his life around machinery to confuse a promising test with a finished system. He paid off the banknote first. Then he drove to the bank with the final receipt and collected the release on his welding trailer. He did not ask for Dale Hargrove. He did not need to. The trailer went back to work the next morning. Over the following months, the exploration company completed more drilling. Results supported continued evaluation. But the project still faced technical and regulatory hurdles. The company had to determine whether it could move enough brine, recover enough lithium, manage waste streams, and operate without creating unacceptable water impacts. Some estimates rose, some schedules slipped. Engineers argued about process options. The county argued about roads. Nearby owners hired their own attorneys. Nothing about it resembled the instant fortune story people in town began telling. Caleb was wealthier than he had ever been, but most of the headline value still belonged to a project that might take years to prove. He kept the cabin. He improved the roof. He ran a proper electrical line. He installed a cistern for hauled fresh water instead of pretending the old well would ever become an irrigation source. The failed forage patch remained visible beside the cabin for a long time. Caleb never replanted it. He liked the reminder. The land had become valuable only after he stopped demanding that it perform the job he had imagined for it. Hargrove's situation changed too. The bank rewrote its surplus property procedure. Mineral and water rights now required separate review before agricultural land could be sold. A checklist that had once been treated as routine became mandatory reading. The rule could not change Caleb's deed. It only changed what the bank would do the next time. For Caleb, the most important consequence came from a place that had nothing to do with lithium. The dairy couple who had once been forced off leased ground had moved again. By then they were renting a small farm from an owner whose loan was in trouble. They had rebuilt pens, repaired the milking area, and sunk years of labor into another property they did not control. The owner wanted to sell before foreclosure. The couple could not qualify for a conventional loan large enough to buy it. Caleb knew the shape of that problem too well, so he used part of his lease money to buy the property through a separate agreement. Then gave the couple a purchase contract with payments tied to a level they could actually carry through weak milk price years. His attorney made sure the contract was clear. Every payment built equity. There was a cure period if a payment was late. There was no 10-day eviction clause hidden in an employment agreement. Caleb did not call it charity. He called it a sale that had enough time in it for working people to survive a bad season. The arrangement cost him something. He could have earned more by selling the farm immediately to a larger operator. He could have put the money into safer investments. He could have waited for the mineral project to make him richer before taking any risk. Instead, he accepted a slower return because he understood the difference between a property that produced the highest number on paper and a place that allowed someone to remain responsible for the work they had already given it. Years earlier, Caleb had wanted only one deed with his own name on it. Now he found himself sitting at a kitchen table with a family whose hands smelled of feed, soap, and machine oil while an attorney placed another deed between them. Caleb turned the paper around and slid it across the table. This time, the name on the owner line belonged to the people who worked the ground.